To the HELSUS Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obenodum, Associate Professor of Sustainability Science with Global Development Studies as the chair. Climate change will harm all, but will disproportionately impact various demographic groups. This is a quotation from the speaker of today's encounters, Anaïs Goubert, an economist who has been researching the color of climate change impact in the US. There, she finds that Black and Indigenous people who contribute the least to the climate problem already suffer the most from it and are likely to do so in the future as well. Does this mean that climate change is, to put it in the words of Jeremy Williams, racist? If so, is the problem a reflection of only modern day racism in the US, or is it an expression of what the leading Black American economist William Darity Jr. has suggested could be called an accumulated racial wealth gap? America's ecological imperialism has been discussed in relation to other lands in the global South. But does the US systematically produce and reproduce a global South on its own territory against its Black and Indigenous population, whose enslavement and exploitation created the world's most powerful economic system, as Rick Williams suggests in his important book, Capitalism and Slavery? What, therefore, could be done to demand reform, resistance, or reparations? Anaïs Goubert, formerly with the Center for Economic and Policy Research, joins us from Florida in America to address these big questions about ecological imperialism and its roots in social and economic stratification. Welcome, Anaïs. I propose that we begin with your analysis, followed by questions or comments from the audience and your responses. For the audience, our practice is to mute our microphones and turn off videos while others have been given the virtual floor. But questions and comments could be sent to me in the personalized chat box. Over to you, Anaïs.
All right, I'm going to start by sharing my screen and then I'll go ahead and get started. All right, I'm hoping everyone can see everything.
Yes.
Yep, beautiful. Okay, so as Franklin mentioned, my name's Anaïs, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a paper I've been working on over the past couple months, looking at slavery, colonialism, and ecological imperialism, and particularly looking at what insights we can get from stratification economics. As Franklin mentioned, and be forewarned, there is a US focus, both in the paper and so also in this presentation, but hopefully there are some things that y'all can grasp from it relating to the Global South in terms of analysis, methodology, those kinds of things. Okay, before we dive into it, I'm just going to do a quick presentation outline just so we all know where we're going. So first, I'll talk a little bit about climate change and stratification economics, define some things and see how they're related before diving into how in the United States climate change is racist and why we, where we can see these effects and why we care about it. And then I'll get into some of the theoretical reasons for the ecological imperialism against Black people and then against Indigenous peoples. At this point, we'll jump into something that I'm calling the long-lasting effects of colonialist-induced environmental changes on Indigenous people. That'll make more sense when we get there, so just bear with me. And then we'll move into inequalities resulting from anti-Black racism and settler colonialism, specifically some that I haven't touched on to that point, that are particularly important when we're considering disproportionate climate change effects. We'll then get to an underlying economic mechanism. So we'll talk a little bit about how all this is related to extreme and racialized capitalism. And then we're going to end with my favorite part, which is the hopeful part, talking about like, where can we go from here? What are our policy options, and sort of looking forward to the future, maybe in a little bit more of a hopeful light than the rest of the presentation. Okay, let's see, diving in. All right, so mainstream environmental economics, like a lot of the economics fields, is largely colorblind. So it doesn't really take into account, it has models, adaptation models, but it doesn't really take into account how people are pushed into specific places, particularly how Black people are led to live in ecologically hazardous locations and kept there. There have been, of course, some movements, some environmental justice movements, particularly in climate change movements, that look at how socioeconomic inequities in the United States result in disproportionate climate risks. But what a lot of these movements fail to like show people is how those socioeconomic inequities and risks are the direct result of slavery, settler colonialism, and other facets of the United States racist history. There has been, on the one hand, you can think of like research looking towards green sustainability, or the idea of like what you think about when you think about a climate change movement. Think about the Sunshine Movement in the United States or traditional environmental groups. And that's what I'm calling the green agenda. And then on the other hand, you've got some people who are looking into this idea of race and marginalization. And then you've got people who are looking to sort of bridge the gaps between those two. So really bring together the ideas of race, marginalization, climate change, the effects, all of that together. I think stratification economics can help us develop this idea of just sustainability a little bit more and bridge that gap a little more efficiently. Just so we're all on the same page about what stratification economics is, it is a subfield of economics, and it uses a range of social sciences and different empirical methodology to look at intergroup inequalities not as resulting from a given individual's actions, but rather as persisting due to intentionally reinforce hierarchical processes and systems. I really want to flag that the subfield explicitly notes that groups that have a higher relative social position, so you can think about in the United States, generally white people, have vested interests in maintaining that higher position. Okay, with all of that out of the way, we can now talk about how in the United States, climate change is racist. So I focus specifically on Black and Indigenous people in the contiguous United States. And they're already facing disproportionate climate risks, and those are expected to worsen. A recent EPA report, so Environmental Protection Agency report, looked particularly at rising temperatures, worsening air quality, and flooding risks. And what we see is that Black people are at greater mortality risk. They're more likely to work in places that are going to be impacted by high heat. They're likely to be impacted by heat's effects on health. And we might even see potential inabilities to meet basic needs as people lose work hours as temperatures rise. In terms of worsening air quality, Black older generations are likely to suffer most from particulate matter pollution that's going to increase with climate change. And then Black children are those who are most likely to be impacted by increased asthma diagnoses. And then in terms of risks from flooding, this is where Indigenous people really are expected to suffer the most in the United States. And we can see that not only in what we think of when we think traditionally about flooding risks, so people tend to think about nuisances like traffic delays, but we can also see limited access to nearby areas like your grocery stores, your job, your community center, your children's school, which are really important places to get to, obviously. We'll also potentially see increased financial responsibilities. So with this, you can think about, really like having to pay to repair your home, not being able to get to work and not being able to afford some of the things you need in your everyday life. There's also some loss of lands and homes. I know this well with hurricanes in Florida, but we really are seeing that Indigenous people in the United States are also most likely to be excluded from protective measures. And so they're most likely to be impacted by the loss of land and home. There are some increased health risks from flooding, that are expected to disproportionately impact both Black and Indigenous people. And then, of course, as mentioned, if you can't get to your job, you can't work. And so there's a loss of additional work hours expected. And these are just some of the impacts that are expected to disproportionately harm Black and Indigenous people. I recommend checking out that EPA report if you want sort of a more detailed analysis of how all that's happening. So, having gone over how climate change is racist in the United States, I wanted to get into the reasons for why. And so we're going to start with some theoretical reasons for the ecological imperialism against Black people. A general overview, my argument is that slavery has had long-lasting impacts on American society, obviously, but most importantly by generating the ideology of a race, by generating a social structure where race is a major determinant of status, and creating an economic system that's dependent on the subordination of Black people. What we find is that also afterwards, you've got other anti-Black systems. So you can think of Jim Crow segregation or even modern day discriminatory systems, including our criminal justice system, that further enhance the impacts that were created by slavery. All of these things taken together, all of these anti-Black systems taken together, have resulted in Black-white inequities and inequalities in nearly every sphere of modern day life. And those inequities are what drive unique and disproportionate climate risks for Black people in the United States. So that's the overview. Coming back to how slavery created the idea of race as an ideology in the US, what we're seeing is that by the mid 1700s, really, you've got whiteness being formally protected by law. Black people are being tied by law to perpetual slavery and labor, that's a better way to say that. And the interactions between Black and white people are being formally protected. We're also seeing that there are a series of anti-Black sentiments during this time that lead to a Supreme Court case that is of particular importance. So we're talking about the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court case, which is where the courts ruled that Black people in the United States were not citizens and that Black slaves or Black enslaved people were property. Obviously, all of these things are overturned following the end of slavery, right? Like that Supreme Court case decision was overturned. But what we're seeing is that that anti-Black sentiment that was developed permeated American culture and continues to set the foundation for modern day discrimination. Slavery also had long-lasting economic impacts. So there's undeniably the fact that slavery unjustly extracted value from the laborers, right? So white landowners used Black labor for free. And so we can place that value at about somewhere between 5.4 to 15.9 trillion 2009 US dollars. So that's already a huge amount of wealth that Black people in the United States were prevented from accumulating. And we see that reflected as well in the wealth gap. There is another long-lasting economic impact that I don't think is talked about enough, and that's the idea of slavery creating a racialized distribution of jobs. So a lot of times enslaved people were made to work in the brutal sides of domestic, service, and agricultural work. And that means that we sort of see an association of Black people with lower paying jobs and a subsequent devaluation of the occupations they were placed in. To this day, Black workers in the United States are overrepresented in low-wage service jobs, and I'm attributing that partially to slavery. Here I have got also continuation from slavery to segregation to current systems of oppression, and what I mean by that is, again, we sort of see that slavery set the foundation, and a lot of what was developed during slavery was maintained through other oppressive systems to create current socioeconomic inequities. Okay. So now we'll dive into some of the theoretical reasons for ecological imperialism against Indigenous people in the US. Here, I want to flag that I'm talking specifically about the contiguous United States. So that obviously excludes Native Hawaiians and Alaskan Natives, but just because it's a slightly different scope and there's more to talk about there with some later stage colonialism. So generally, I argue that settler colonialism has shaped both the geographic spaces and the social, economic, and political conditions of Indigenous communities in the United States. I talk about several mechanisms of US colonialism or American colonialism, including genocide, ethnocide, historical discrimination, and the changing of ecological conditions that are important to Native communities. But all of these mechanisms have resulted in Native Americans facing severe and unequal impacts from climate change in most spheres of life, but most importantly in health, economic well-being, and in cultural situations. So in terms of some of these sort of mechanisms, I outlined 3 major steps on this slide. So you've got what I'm calling the explicit violence, or the laying of the settler colonial foundation. And that refers to the early days of American colonialism. So you can think about the Spanish and other European powers and their invasion of what would eventually become the United States. And what I really want to flag here is that it was just a period of indiscriminate killing, whether through direct murder or through warfare, slavery, the spread of European-born disease. And it continues through westward expansion and after the American Revolution. So really, this period is just marked by huge amounts of brutality. And I'm classifying it as a real genocide of Indigenous people in the United States. So that's the first sort of step. The second step of American settler colonialism is this idea of elimination through Americanization. And that's really when, after the end of westward expansion, what we're seeing is a shift in federal policy towards a policy of assimilation through land allotment and educational policies. And so at this point, instead of trying to engage in genocide, we're seeing the US government turn towards ethnocide, the stealing of Indigenous lands, be it through sort of like requiring them to enroll with the US government and only giving them specific parcels of land, requiring them to use that land in specific ways, or even things as simple as, you know, you didn't register, well, you don't get the land. And then we've also got, so that was all in the 1887 Dawes Act. Sorry, I didn't know if I flagged that. And then you've got the educational policies, and those are policies like the 1819 Indian Civilization Fund Act and the Peace Act, also known as the Act of April 10th, 1869. And both of those created this idea of schools specifically for Indigenous children. There are 3 major types of those. I'm not going to go into all that, but what I will say is that all of these schools aim to separate Native children from their families, their tribes, their cultures. They were a deep source of trauma, as well as a way to really lean heavily on the idea that these individuals, Native individuals, could not self-govern, could not be in charge of their own determination, and had to be controlled by the US government, which is obviously untrue. Both the goals and the processes of Americanization or assimilation policies are important in generating climate risk for current Indigenous communities in the United States. And the way that that works is that the goal of these policies is to generate a racial ideology, right? So not only are we taking land away, not only are we separating families, but we're also creating a racial ideology of Indigenous people, where Indigenous peoples are viewed as so far removed from this idea of white civility that their savageness, quote unquote, cannot be saved, can't be addressed. And we're seeing a racial ideology where Native adults are deemed unfit to take care of their children, they're deemed unfit to take care of their lands or to self-govern. So that's one of the goals. And that in and of itself is creating a racial ideology that harms Native Americans today. The processes, right? So this land theft and this sort of like separation of family also creates unique climate vulnerabilities because it opened up huge portions of land for carbon intensive economics. And then we're going to move on to the third and final step, which is in a so-called post-colonial United States, the idea of termination. For a lot of Americans, they believe we're living in a post-colonial United States. I clearly believe that to be untrue, but one of the policies that I think really marks how untrue that is this idea of termination. So following the end of the World War II and of the New Deal, you're seeing a 1953 policy of termination come up, and that policy essentially denies Indigenous sovereignty and disbands a lot of tribes in terms of federal lists, right? So the United States government no longer recognizes a large portion of Native American tribes at this point. What this means is that those tribes are no longer protected, and they also are now expected to engage with US laws and taxes in a way that they didn't have to before. At the same time, we're seeing policies that aim to disperse hundreds of thousands of Native Americans away from their tribal lands. And so taken together, this disbursement, as well as this sort of policy of termination, leads to a lot of people being separated from their families, from their tribes, from their cultures, and moving into a racialized distribution of jobs again. So we're seeing Native American men be pigeonholed to low wage and traditionally lowly regarded jobs. And we're seeing Native American women be sort of moved towards domestic service work. And so again, we're ending up with a situation similar to that we saw with Black people in the United States, which is a racialized distribution of jobs. Now, when we're talking about settler colonialism and climate change, it's insufficient to consider it just through inequities. So I really relied heavily on the work of an Indigenous scholar named White. And he talks about climate change not being a new or a future trend for Indigenous peoples, but rather the experience of going back to the future. And what I mean by this, what I think I've understood him to mean by this, is this idea that climate change is oppressive anthropogenic change to the environment, right? So it's human caused and it's harming specific communities. But that is something that Indigenous peoples in the United States have lots of experience with, because from the very beginning of settler colonialism, the aim was indeed to promote erasure, both physical and cultural, through the containment of Indigenous people and through the implementation of oppressive anthropogenic change to ecosystems particularly important to Indigenous people. At this point, I also want to flag that settler colonialism opened the path to carbon-intensive economics by opening huge portions of land that were previously not used for agriculture or deforestation, urbanization, to those sorts of work, right? And so we're seeing that settler colonialism and climate change are very deeply linked. Okay, so there are some inequalities that I haven't touched on yet, or haven't really touched on yet, that result from anti-Black racism and settler colonialism. I'm not going to go super in depth into any of these, but I do want to talk about the fact that, for example, there's a huge Black-white wealth gap in the United States, and that can be attributed to slavery and is obviously very important in terms of climate risk, right? So the amount of money that you have, or the amount of wealth differentials, sort of are a flag for how well you can manage some of the risks that are going to come up with climate change. In terms of housing, access to safe and affordable housing is incredibly important, both for your general well-being, but also for developing economic well-being and resilience in terms of climate risk. There are large disparities in health, both in terms of access to healthcare, the amount of people who can access healthcare insurance in the United States, and discrimination within healthcare spheres. Obviously, there's also issues with the education system being rigged to best help white folks instead of Black or Indigenous people. There are some career and employment risks, both from discrimination, but also differential unemployment risks. So this idea that Black people in the United States face a different unemployment risk than their white counterparts, both in terms of the length of unemployment, as well as the amount of government assistance Black people receive during those spells, so less than their white counterparts. And then, of course, our criminal justice system, I think, is well known by all to be sort of aiming to control specific populations and to further harm those. And all of these inequalities sort of set people up to be incapable, or set groups up to be incapable to properly address or adapt to climate change harms. And I can also dive in later if anybody wants, but all of these are also, I argue, the result of slavery and settler colonialism, or they're like a cumulative legacy of that. Okay, we're almost at the end. Underlying economic mechanisms. So both slavery and settler colonialism are underpinned by a similar economic or the same economic system. And that's the idea of a racial capitalist system. You can think of racial capitalism as having two general pillars, and that's the colonial relation and the anti-Black relation. So the colonial relation is what establishes the material foundation for modern day racial capitalism. And the idea here is by dispossessing indigenous lands in a US sovereign context and making them private property, what you're doing is you're getting the raw materials or the material foundation for racial capitalism, right? So the theft of indigenous lands sort of creates this like basis that you need for modern day racial capitalism. And then the other pillar focuses more on the anti-Black relation. And that's the idea that the ideological foundations, as well as the labor that you need for modern day racial capitalism, is rooted in the theft of Black labor, both enslaved people's physical labor, as well as Black women's reproductive and biological labor in the beginning. I argue throughout the paper that settler colonialism and slavery mark the beginning of modern day racial capitalism because they establish its material and ideological foundations. It's also important to note that modern day racial capitalism is in a lot of ways considered to be sort of the driving cause of climate change. And so you can think about settler colonialism and slavery sort of also being driving causes of climate change as we know it. Okay, and now we're at my favorite part, which is the sort of more hopeful, what can we do part. So there are three major policy types or policy options that I think are worth considering. And those are ecological and economic reparations, land repatriations, and decolonizing environmental movements and legislation. The easiest of these, or the most politically feasible, is probably decolonizing environmental movements and legislation. This, I think, has already begun to happen in some spheres when we think of things like the Green New Deal in the United States. But really what I'm talking about here is engaging deeply in conversations that are uncomfortable, listening to Indigenous people and Black people when they are telling us what it is that is important in this sort of sphere, and decentering white voices. In my opinion, this happens at all scales, right? So it can happen both in our personal lives as well as on a federal policy scale. I also think that a good example of this is the recent infrastructure bill in the United States. While deeply imperfect, Biden's infrastructure plan did have some strong focus on ensuring that some of the racial disparities in access to infrastructure, both physical and things like broadband, were addressed. That's sort of the beginning to me of some decolonization of some important legislation. The next one that I want us to consider is the next easiest, or second to last hardest, and that's the idea of ecological and economic reparations. A lot of people have heard a lot about this. We talk a lot about economic reparations for slavery, paying back debts, and it can take a variety of forms. It doesn't have to be through paying back debts, but that's generally one that I agree with. I do want to note that ecological reparations are similar to economic reparations, but they do focus more specifically on the racial, sexual, gendered violence of climate change. And so they're just economic reparations that are a little more tailored and a little more focused. And then lastly, the least politically feasible, but still important to consider, is this idea of land repatriation. In the United States, this looks like giving land back to the people to whom it belongs. The reason that this is a deeply unsettling process, really not politically feasible, is because it requires, in some ways, a real restructuring, not only of our geographic spaces, but also of our political and economic systems. And that doesn't seem like it's in the best interests of all of those in power, obviously. And it also requires individuals to really reckon with their personal histories as well as their group's histories. So while not necessarily politically feasible, it's important to consider even in our everyday lives. And so you guys might have heard of Americans talking deeply about whose land are you on? And so I think what we can draw from land repatriation is not only the general policy and the large scale policy, but also this idea of acknowledging who you are, where you live, and the places you are in. And that's it for my presentation. So I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Anaïs, for your sobering analysis, but very hopeful